All right. Our lunchtime discovery presentation will begin here in the Daily Planet Theater in just a short moment. Grab a seat, join us on the first, second, or third floors inside the globe to meet Emilee Briggs and hear about her research on freshwater fish in North Carolina. We'll begin shortly. All right, let's get started. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. My name is Chris, and I'm curator for the Daily Planet Theater and your host for our weekly series here inside the globe, our Lunchtime Discovery series. This series is put on by the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education within the Department of Environmental Quality and hosted by us here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. We all work together to try to bring you a great program every week where you can meet interesting, exciting people who are doing really cool work. And we always try to find people who are pretty local right here in North Carolina so that we can learn a little bit about what's going on in our own backyards. Thanks for coming out. These talks are also broadcast live online. Hello to anybody who might be watching on the internet. And if you're watching online, know that you can post questions in the chat feature of the live stream website. You can also tweet at us using the hashtag Lunchtime Discovery. So if you've got questions throughout, send those to us. We'd be happy to answer. And then after the talk, if you're here with me inside the globe, you'll get the chance to ask your questions of our guest speaker too. Today's guest is Emilee Briggs from North Carolina State University. She's a graduate student who I said is just about to defend a master's thesis. Wishing you the best of luck. I'm pretty sure you'll nail it because already this presentation looks pretty awesome. Let's learn about the freshwater fish of North Carolina and what's going on with Emilee Briggs.
So hi, thanks for coming to my talk. And again, my name is Emilee, and I'm going to be going over some of my master's research. Cities are expanding at an unprecedented rate. In the 1800s, only 3% of the world's population lived in a city or an urban area. By the 1900s, this only increased by about 11%, and it wasn't until the early 2000s that a majority of the world's population lived in an urban area or what we'd call a city. So historically, these haven't really been big areas in terms of how much of the population that they hold. However, again, in the early 2000s, we started seeing this exponential growth, and it's projected that by 2050, over 75% of the world's population will live in a city. And in the US, this is even greater, about 90%. So we're seeing this huge shift of people into cities and this new concentration of people within a small area. And as we get this increase of people and we see this growth, it demands an increase of physical area as well. So cities aren't just growing in number, but they're growing in area, they're sprawling. And the process of converting land, so creating something that was rural and turning it into a city is called urbanization. We think of it also where it's called urban sprawl. So it's just a term that describes the conversion or the creating of a city. And urbanization is happening most rapidly within the Southeast. Here you can see, oh, I'm going to do this way, I think. Maybe, yeah. So everything in yellow highlights the current urban areas within the Southeast. And here, everything in red shows the areas that are most likely to become urban by 2050. And when we look at this even closer, I can highlight this area is a corridor from Raleigh, North Carolina, down to Atlanta, Georgia, and it represents a tripling in the current urban area. They've termed it the Southern Megalopolis. So the current urban area is going to triple in size and create this large urban corridor. So why does it matter that urban areas are expanding? Well, again, this is unprecedented growth. They're becoming these new areas, and they're creating dramatic changes in the landscape. And again, this concentration of human impacts. So as these areas continue to sprawl rapidly, it creates an interaction with the surrounding ecosystems. We like to think that cities are sort of like these islands or human-centric areas, but in reality we get a lot of interactions with wildlife, and there's a lot of potential impact of urban areas to these surrounding ecosystems. So it presents this critical question of what's going to happen as these areas continue to expand. Previous research has primarily focused on terrestrial systems when looking at this question. So there are a number of identified mechanisms and responses that they've identified in terrestrial systems associated with urbanization. So for example, they've talked about fragmentation, which is just, if you think about a big forest and you cut it up into pieces, you've limited the movement between these areas. There's also habitat loss, the heat island effect, so that cities are actually warmer than the surrounding landscape, and that there are even weather pattern changes. But we don't know a whole lot about the impacts of urbanization to aquatic systems. They're understudied, and the only real response that has been documented or that people have looked at is the urban stream syndrome. So what is that? It's just a term that describes all of the effects to a stream in response to urbanization. And these two pictures are a really good example of a pristine or a forested stream versus an urban stream that has gone through this urban stream syndrome. So this is the non-urban stream. This is in Granville County. It's about, this is actually one of my sample sites. There's nothing around this area. It's forest for miles. But there are a few key things that I want you to note in this picture. So one, note that there's what we call in-stream complexity. All that means is that within the stream, there are a bunch of different habitats. So when you think of like a stream or a river, sometimes you see what we call a riffle, or there's a lot of, like a little waterfall. There are pools, so there's a lot of different habitat and movement. The next thing is that this is not what we call channelized. So the stream has a lot of twists and turns, which helps slow down the flow, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's not channelized, and there's a lot of riparian area. If you look at this, you can see greenery all along the banks. And here's that same non-urban stream with those different areas highlighted. Now we'll compare that to an urban stream which has gone through or is affected by the urban stream syndrome. So conversely, note that there is a lack of in-stream complexity. So in this stream, another one of my sample sites, or the areas that I've looked at, it's pretty much just the same flat water for as far as I've gone through, maybe 600 meters, 1,000 meters, so a pretty long stretch. And then it's what we call channelized. So before we saw that stream, the non-urban one, it had a lot of twists and turns, whereas this one is a straight line almost throughout. And so when it rains and it floods, that means that water is going to move through the stream really quickly, bringing a lot of sediment, and then also just carving out in like the bank, so it becomes deep and just easy for water to move through. And then there's no riparian area, so you can see that. Maybe there we go. Right here, there's just there's been a lot of erosion, and you can see the different roots from the trees, and there's not nearly as much riparian area. Again, this is everything highlighted, and you can then go back through and compare and see these subtle differences. There are more dramatic examples of the urban stream syndrome, but I wanted to show you sites that are in Raleigh, North Carolina, and this urban site is actually right next to North Hills, if y'all know where North Hills is. It's hidden, and these streams are hidden throughout the area. You don't really see these streams in the urban landscape. So we know these responses. We've talked a little bit about the urban stream syndrome, but there's still a lot that's unknown about what happens to these streams. First, what we call an urban stream or an urban aquatic area is highly variable. It could be anything to the stream that I just showed you, or a ditch that runs along the side of the road. And then the degree that they are affected is variable. They are all on some level affected, but some streams, are in these urban sites are totally devoid of anything, whereas some look, what I would say like, okay, like you can't really visually see anything when you look at it. And then we don't know why this happens. A lot of the mechanisms or a lot of the things that are driving the changes in these streams are unknown. And so my master's research aims to address that knowledge gap, trying to bridge, what's happening in these urban areas, how are they impacting everything around them, and then specifically looking at the impacts on these stream ecosystems, which are important but are, again, understudied. So, and I think that just personally they're really interesting ecosystems, but these small streams in general are critical to the larger freshwater health. And so before I go into my specific research, I'll give you a little bit of background of what I'm talking about when I talk about a stream. That's pretty vague, it's a general term, but I'm talking about something that's called a headwater stream. So think about like the creek that runs through your backyard or a brook. It's something that you could easily jump across, or if you fell in, you could stand right back up and your head would be above water. So they're what we call wadable. They're just the smallest part of a river. So we're not talking about anything really big. They're these small streams. But they provide a lot of critical habitat. So for example, is anybody in here like a trout fisherman? Maybe? No? They provide the critical habitat when trout are trying to spawn, provide refuge for different fish. They also mitigate flood damage. So it allows water as it goes through to soak into the ground, and then they filter pollutants as they enter in the larger streamways. So it has a few different important functions, but they also comprise a majority of river miles, about 85% of the river miles in the continental United States. And to put that into context, you can see here in dark blue is the Neuse River, which is the major river that runs through the Raleigh-Durham area. It also includes Falls Lake, which is where we get our drinking water. So the dark blue is Neuse River, and then the light blue are all of the contributing headwater streams. So that shows you sort of the impact that these small streams have and the concentration that they can carry. And then they eventually feed into these larger streams and rivers and lakes. And their small size makes them vulnerable. So if you think about it, if there's a new subdivision behind your house or a parking lot or a grocery store is built, it's not really going to have a lot of effect on the Neuse River. I mean, this flows all the way from Raleigh down out to the coast. But it will impact these small streams, and these streams are what's feeding into these things that we use, like, for example, Falls Lake for our drinking water. And so that leads me to my overall research question, which is how does urbanization impact streamfish assemblage and drive ecosystem change? And by streamfish assemblage, that's just talking about what kind of fish live there and how abundant are they, how dense are they. And I'm looking specifically at North Carolina within that Neuse River watershed. So why am I looking at fish? Well, they can tell us a lot about a system, and they, more so than something like water quality, which only really gives us a snapshot, these fish can live for a number of years, and so we can really get a history of what's been happening in the stream. They're what we call bioindicators, which is just a living organism that indicates the health of an ecosystem. So think of them as the canary in the coal mine, if you will. And these are some of the species that I found that are native to that are in North Carolina streams. So if we remember back to that urban stream, I highlighted a few changes within it. So in addition to seeing the actual physical changes to a stream as an indicator of what's happening, we can also look at the changes to the biotic community. So we can look at everything that's living in there and use that information to see the changes that are happening. Previous research on other sorts of disturbances, so other things that might impact these streams, have documented that as the streams are degraded, that there's a loss of species richness and of the abundance of fish that are in there. And these urban streams are degraded. They're impaired waters, so they are being affected by what's happening. So we can use these to see, use these fish that are in there to look at sort of the story that the stream's trying to tell us. It's also been documented that we'll see a loss of sensitive species, and then again, these changes in the density and the density of the species and the types of species that we'll see in these urban streams. So we can use the fish that are in there to really get an idea of what's happening. And then the second thing is that I want to hit on is the study location. So why did I choose Raleigh, North Carolina, or the Upper Neuse? Well, so the Southeast is going to experience this largest urban growth, this largest urbanization within the entire U.S. And North Carolina is at the top of that list of those states. It includes also the Upper Neuse, two of the largest cities, the Raleigh-Durham area, which has about 2.2 million people, and it grew 40% from 2000 to 2012, which makes it the fastest growing metropolitan area in the United States. So this is one of the best places to really get a glimpse of in real time urbanization in the making, or urbanization in the works, if you will. So I had two main research objectives. Again, my overall question is just, what's happening to the fish in this stream? And I answered that by trying to look at these two specific targets. The first one was just to document what is living in these streams. What's living in an urban stream versus what's living in a forested stream? How do they differ? And then the second was to try to link specific traits of these fish back to specific traits of the watershed. So can I look at a watershed and predict the growth rate of a fish? Or vice versa, can I look at the growth rate of a fish and tell what kind of watershed that it lives in? And by hopefully understanding that relationship, I can then understand why these streams are being degraded. And I'll go ahead and focus on my first objective. So for my first objective, this happened between May and August of 2016. I looked at 9 different sites, again across within the Upper Neuse watershed, but specifically within Wake, Durham, and Granville County. And so the green sites represent what I call forested sites, which you can see there. And then these red dots are what I consider urban sites. And I'll keep that, that color scheme throughout the talk. So the first step was, what is considered an urban stream? How can I take my data or whatever I find and present it to somebody and say that I definitively can tell that this is an urban stream? How do I quantify that? I decided, or based off of previous research, I calculated the watershed of my sampling location, and the watershed is just the land area that contributes to the stream. So if I pour out my bottle of water, where is that going to end up eventually? What stream, what river? And this is another example. So you can see this little dot here. So all of this gray area is the land area where if you, again, pour out that bottle of water, if it rains, all of the water within that area is going to eventually drain into that stream. And then using that watershed, I can calculate the land cover. So how much of that watershed is a city? How much of that watershed is, an oak forest? And it's important, or it was important, to look at this specific watershed because, again, you saw that I had the Upper Neuse already. People have already gone out and looked at this, but these are really, again, small streams. The data for this watershed does not exist. I have to go out and calculate it myself, and it can vary pretty drastically based off of where you're looking in the stream. So this is, for example, one small stream segment, and then 2 different hypothetical sampling points. So if you're farther upstream, you're going to get a much smaller watershed than you would if you went farther downstream. That larger watershed is almost, twice, if not 3 times the size of the original one. So I'm getting a really accurate look at what is feeding into the area that I'm sampling. And then these are all my watersheds for all my sample sites within the larger Neuse watershed. So you can see how small these really are. And then we'll talk about specifically this green one is a forested watershed, and this red one is what I consider an urban watershed. And then these are these larger. So you can see that this is the data, or this is what a forested watershed looks like. So everything that's green is some type of forest, and then everything that is red down here that's Western Boulevard right there. And so I got this data from the USGS, the United States Geological Survey, and they put out these satellites and collect data across the entire US, and then they go through and they actually map out these different land uses. And this is the key that I use, and the most important part here is that everything in this green box is something that's considered a forested type, and then everything in this red box is associated with urbanization. So it's these highly developed, everything from high developed to low developed areas. Think of something that's high developed as right in the middle of downtown Raleigh, and something that's low developed as more of a suburban area. So after I was able to determine which sites were urban versus forested, I went out to different streams and I sampled a 50-meter section. So it's really not any farther than where I am to the edge of the room. Actually, no, it's a little bit farther than that. Maybe from where I am to that glass box behind y'all. And then using what's called a backpack electrofisher, I blocked off either section of my stream, and I was able to collect the fish. And the backpack electrofisher looks like this. So this is the actual unit. And it pumps out electricity. It doesn't kill any of the fish. It just stuns them really quickly, and then I can net them up, and this is a demonstration. So we've got the net, and then my backpack, and then we just scoop them up. It's a lot of fun. Again, none of them die, just stunned. So then, based off of the fish that I collect, I can get information on the species richness, so what kind of species live there, and then how many of those species are there. And these are 2 individuals from the same stream, and they're the same species. And so you can see that there's a lot of variation in what we're going to find. Something that's tiny, probably not even a year old, versus something that's maybe 3 years old. And again, this is what I mean when I say that it's more than just a snapshot. We're getting a long timeline of what's been happening in these streams. So what did I find? Again, note that everything green is forested and everything that's red is urban, and that this axis here, this represents what I found overall against all of my streams, and then I separated it out by the types of fish that are there. So I put all the minnows together, all the sunfish together, all the catfish together, and then here is the density. So the big things to notice is this overall total, or this overall density, and that the urban areas are significantly less dense, so they have much fewer fish than in these forested areas. And when we look at that across those different families, you can see that it's mostly due to the sunfish and the minnows. So that's why I decided to take that overall density and compare it against the different families, so I could see, what's really driving the changes here. Is it just across the board that there are different densities? And that's not really the case, that it's really these minnows and these sunfish that we're losing in the urban streams that are leading to the decreases that we see. And then the x-axis here is the same, so we have the overall versus those different types of fish. Green is forested watersheds or the forested sites, red is urban. And then here on the y-axis, we have the species richness. And we see these same patterns when we look at just the total number of species. So again, before we were looking at how many individuals per meter squared are they if I go into an urban site versus a forested. And now I'm looking at, if I go into an urban site, how many different species am I going to find versus these forested sites? And we see that same pattern, decreases in the urban sites, and that's driven by a lack of or a loss of sunfish and minnow species. So to put that sort of all in one big summary, these urban sites that are in North Carolina are characterized by these decreases in forested land cover. So they are almost all of them are, when you combine them all together, they're about 80% developed, or 80% of those watersheds of that total area is urban. So they're almost predominantly developed. And that we're seeing a decrease in this total density, a decrease in the species richness, and that this is really due to a loss of the minnow and sunfish families. And when I took all of my data from my fish assemblage structure, or from those different fish, and I compared it to what I saw from my environmental variables, we see that this is really driven by the developed land cover, and then the conductivity. And conductivity is just another measure of developed land cover. Okay, so I finished my first objective. I went in and I compared these, pristine or these forested sites compared to these urban sites, and I saw differences. But again, this is pretty variable across different across different urban streams, and that the urbanization itself is variable. So not all cities are created equal, or they're not all the same. And so think of something like a big skyline like New York City compared to something like a suburb. They're both technically urban. They're both what we would call developed areas, but they can have very different impacts. And by understanding what it is exactly about the different types of urbanization, or what's happening within those different types of urban areas, I can hopefully understand why we're seeing the changes that we're seeing. Because again, we know that things are changing in these streams, but we don't know exactly why. And so for my second objective, I wanted to link these specific traits within fish, so individual level traits and then some population level traits, combine that with the watershed data, some more in-depth watershed data, and then hopefully find patterns in there that show us what's driving these changes. So I sampled about 40 sites across an entire gradient the next summer. And so you can see it goes everywhere from downtown Raleigh out to Granville, and I was looking across, again, this entire gradient. So hopefully by looking at all the different types of streams and land use types, I can see these patterns. So that first part, again, was looking at these watershed level traits. What I did was almost the same as the year before, but I looked across data from 2001 to 2016. So I looked across a number of years, and I also looked at impervious surface, which is just another term for the developed land. So when we looked at those watersheds earlier that were developed, they're all pink. And so impervious surface is just, this is an example here. So if you take away all the other land types, how much of that is just developed? And then I linked these, again, to these individual and these population level traits using 3 focal species, and I'll talk about them in a little bit. So I looked at specifically stoichiometry. So what is that? It is a fancy term talking about the ratio of elements in your body. So every living thing has a certain ratio of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. But these can be altered by the things that are in our environment. So in theory, I should be able to go and look at the carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus within these fish, and it should be different in urban streams than in rural streams. Again, remember that these small headwater streams are really important to filtering pollutants, and that they're really affected, so that if there are a lot of pollutants and a lot of contaminants, the ratio should be altered. And then the second individual trait that's really important is this age. And I also looked at length and weight. So how do you age a fish? Well, you use these things called otoliths. They're their ear bones. And you can age them like you do a tree. So each of these rings, I've highlighted with a little red marker, represents an age. So this would be a 3-year-old fish that I caught. And then using the distance between those ages and then the length that I got when I caught it and the weight that I got when I caught it, I can look at these population level traits like the age structure. So how many fish are 1-year-old versus how many fish are 2-year-old? So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about age structure. I can also look at the size structure. So what's the variation in their size? And I can even look at their growth rates. That's just a few of them and the big ones that I looked at in my study. But by understanding sort of using this age data, I can get a lot of information. And then I looked at only 3 types of species in these urban streams. So if you remember back to my last objective, sunfish were really driving these changes or really responsible for the changes that we're seeing between these forested and urban sites. So by focusing on these species, I can get a better idea, or I'm looking at only the individuals or only the types of fish that are really important in looking at the differences or like what's happening from forested to urban. And I looked at these 3 species because, again, for my previous summer, the data showed that they're pretty important and that they're responding to something. They're also commonly found in North Carolina, so I should, in theory, be able to find all of these fish in any given stream that I go into. And then they also encompass a different tolerance levels. So this is a bluegill. These guys are pretty intolerant, and they're pretty sensitive compared to red-breast sunfish up here. And then these guys are green sunfish. Then the green sunfish, by comparison, can live pretty much absolutely anywhere. If there's water and maybe occasional food, they'll be happy. Whereas these bluegill are really sensitive, and they need more specific requirements. So after I went out to each of my streams, I looked at the 40 sites, did the same thing that I did the year before, used that backpack electrofisher to look at, to collect the different fish, and then I looked at those traits that I told you. 2 interesting and important things came out. So when I looked at those watershed level traits and I compared it to what I saw in these fish assemblages, one of the main reasons or the main drivers of the variation was this urban land cover. We already knew that, but it's at least interesting to see that when I compare everything and put it in these different tests, that comes out as the most important factor if you're looking at a stream, the amount of urban land cover. And the second most important thing that was explained or responsible for the variation that we saw was the width of the stream and the velocity. So these wide, fast streams were associated with urban sites, which makes sense because if you go through and look at a stream that's affected by the urban stream syndrome, they're these channelized, so they're these, they've got high velocities, they've got a lot of water running through them at a quick rate, and they're pretty wide because as that water pushes through, it's carving out the banks, and they're losing all that riparian area. So it's in line with what we would expect, and it gives us a clue of what we should be looking at when we're looking at this environmental data. And so keep in mind, so urban streams that are pretty wide and have a lot of high velocity are influencing what we're seeing for these fish populations. In particular, we saw that red-breast sunfish benefit from urbanization, so that they are positively associated with fast streams that are pretty wide and very urbanized. So we saw a lot of young individuals, and that we saw them at fairly high densities, and that they also had higher growth rates. So these red-breast sunfish are just camping out in the urban streams, and they're doing totally fine. Whereas the bluegill, as we expected, did not do well. And then surprisingly, the green sunfish didn't do as well either. But when we were thinking about this study and we were going out sampling the streams, we expected the bluegill to be more of an indicator or to be more important in determining what we were going to find or the patterns that we would see. And we didn't really see any patterns with the stoichiometry, which there are a lot of things that could be influencing that. And I'm still actually analyzing the results from this. So we're going to be looking into that a little bit more, but we can definitely talk about these results related to the age versus the environmental data. So what does that mean overall and in context? So remember, for that first objective, I'm just trying to document things and document these changes. And we saw from that first summer that there's a shift in these urban streams from species-rich, high-density streams in forested areas to these low densities and few species in urban areas, and that this was driven by the land cover type. So if something was really urban, it explained what we were seeing in that stream. And that for that second objective, we were trying to identify these potential reasons why. Why are we seeing this? What about these patterns is going to give us an idea of what's important or like what's causing this urban stream syndrome. And so we focused on these individual and population level traits, and we linked this back to the watershed level characteristics, and we found that red-breast sunfish are a potential indicator species when looking at urbanization. So we weren't able to answer what exactly is driving it, but it gives us a really good idea of, as we continue to do these future studies, there's something about this relationship going on. There's something about these red-breast sunfish that we can hopefully measure or quantify, and that's going to give us a better idea or help us find out what's degrading these urban streams. And this is just the first step in understanding the impacts that urbanization has on these small headwater streams. Again, urbanization itself is not very well studied, and headwater streams are, there's very little known about them in terms of like their relation to urbanization. So we're just really trying to gather this preliminary, this baseline information to help us understand how to eventually try to restore or mitigate or stop the damage that they're causing. And so I'd like to acknowledge my funding sources, so NC State, NSF, and then the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. And then these are all of my technicians who, for 2 summers, I dragged through about, 45, 50 different streams. And with that, I will take any questions.
Let's give Emilee a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Let's do questions. If you've got one, wave at me. I'll bring you a microphone if you're down here with me on the first floor. If you're up on the second or third floors and you got something you want to ask, wave down at us. We'll call on you, and then you yell, and then we'll use the microphones to repeat the questions. We'll still make sure that everyone in the room can hear. So wave at me if you've got one, but I think I'll get us started. You've been in lots of streams, lots of different habitats. What do you think are the keys to protecting these environments for a greater diversity of species in urban settings? So like what do we do here in urban Raleigh if we want to try to increase diversity or protect watersheds?
So I think that it goes back to what's happening in this watershed, this larger watershed. So a lot of restoration programs for these streams and rivers have tried to go out and put more riparian area or put more in, add more rocks to make the streams more complex and things like that. But I think that they have a pretty limited impact, and that it's more important as we're designing and building these cities to build them in a way that includes things like green space and ways to prevent the pollutants from entering these streams. And so it's more about this big city planning and thinking about the surrounding ecosystems when we're building our cities.
Around. And what actually got you interested in fish to begin with?
Well, I actually worked at the Museum of Natural Sciences as a junior curator, and
Yes!
yeah. So when I was in high school, I worked here and did a rotation with the veterinary services and worked with fish, which is a weird way to get into it, but I just think that they're pretty cool, and then decided to go to NC State and studied fisheries, and ever since then I've been really interested in it. But I've always been interested in being outside and being in streams. And then again, the more I learned about them, the more it was just, you know, that these are really important small habitats that nobody really cares about. But you should, because they're cool.
Hey, thanks for doing this research, by the way. I heard that you can test, or when you look at an otolith, that you can tell like different stressors that fish have encountered in their lives. Are you seeing any differences when you look at their ear bone in the urban fish versus the forested areas?
So any sort of stressors that I would see would be using that otolith. So again, I'm looking at that otolith, I'm counting how old it is, and then based off of the distances between that year 1 ring and the year 2 ring, I'm able to look at the growth. So like how fast they grow from year 1 to year 2, year 2 to year 3, and etc. So that would be the only way that I'd be able to look at stressors, and that is a really important part of that second objective that I'm still looking at, is looking at what's happening with these growth rates. And so again, when we look at these red breast sunfish, based off of the measurements that I get off the otoliths, we're seeing that they are doing really well. Whereas we can go through, and yes, the growth rates might be slower for something like a bluegill, but you really don't see a drop in the growth rate until they're about year 3. So that's like the specific detail that I can tell. But when looking at the big overall story, it's more about the general things that are happening within the population. But yeah, you can tell a lot from them. They're pretty cool things to look at.
There we go. Okay. You mentioned for a lot of the streams, especially the smaller ones, they're a lot more vulnerable than, say, the larger ones or the actual river itself. And those streams kind of needing more protection. Mm-hmm. What, if any, advice would you have for, say, homeowners that have these little streams going through their properties? Would you prefer, say, a more active approach to keeping those clean and fresh and healthy, or a more passive, just kind of let it do its thing approach?
I think you can take an active approach in the sense that when I'm going through a lot of these urban streams, you'd be surprised by the just amount of like trash and things that I find, and that's something really simple that you can do, just to, like, be a good steward of those spaces. But I don't have anything other than that really specific. That's honestly, I think the best thing that you can do is just like with whatever access you have to that stream or whatever part runs through, just being a good steward and making sure that you keep it clean. You know, don't dump fertilizer in there or things like that.
Thanks for the really interesting talk. I was curious, the forested streams, mm-hmm. Did they have a lot of variability amongst themselves? And I mean, I guess my question is, how much variation was there among the categories you had? So you had 3 forested and 3 urban. So were the forested streams just very, very, very different from the urban streams? Mm-hmm. Or was there some variation among the forested and then just a lot of variation between the forest and urban?
And you're just talking about the fish in general, not like the land, not like the watershed types or anything like that?
Yeah, that's what I'm...
Okay. So the forested streams were not variable at all. And so I had 9 total stream sites for the first year, and 6 of those were forested. And then I had 3 urban sites. But the forested sites were not very variable. And it was pretty consistent throughout each one what we were finding. Whereas the most variation came from these urban sites. But the urban sites were so different from the forested sites that there wasn't really a whole lot of overlap, if that makes sense. So forested sites were just totally by and away different from the urban sites. And I ran them through a statistical test. I won't get into any of the details, but it's a good indicator of like how things group, and they're just totally distinct. But again, forested sites, very similar versus most of the variation is in these urban sites.
I'm just curious, do you have what quality data as a comparison or in contrast? And also to those fish, do you do tissue study? And also in what quality you can have the chemical index, and biological, especially microbial index, can correspondent to what the stress level you're talking about here. I think maybe more substantial.
I do take water quality data. I take a lot of it, and didn't want to list it all on there. It'd be one whole slide of everything that we take. And then, so when we do stoichiometry, which is again that carbon, nitrogen to phosphorus ratio, I'm taking about 10 fish from every stream. They're variable in size, so I'm getting a whole bunch of different sizes. And I use the whole fish and then send that off. So I'm getting tissues from them, and I'm looking at that specifically, but no other sort of tissue samples. I think that it would be interesting to look at that, and I think that would be a future study to look at that more in depth.
Hi. This is a follow-up question. If I remember right, all of your forested sites were upstream of the urban sites. Is that true? And I wonder if that is the case, if you were able to find a forested site below an urban site, if the same, well, how do you say, the same characteristics in the fish, you said that they were pretty consistent, if you would find the same consistency.
So in the first year, again, with those 9 sites, they did tend to be farther upstream. The only real place I could find to get a good forested site was in Granville County, and Granville County is north of here. But again, these are headwater streams, so in theory, they shouldn't be really influenced by anything too farther upstream of them, because they are like the headwater, they are the beginning feeding into the larger stream. I think it would be more sort of confounding if I was looking at the Neuse River and itself and looked at an urban site above a forested site or vice versa. But for my second study, I had 40 sites and went pretty much everywhere I could possibly go. And I have forested sites across both above and below my urban sites. So I got a much better picture of what's happening.
Hi, so maybe this is I've heard similar questions along these veins, and maybe wording it in a different way. Do you have any sort of research insights or any hypotheses about what it is about the redbreast that make them particularly well adapted to these streams? Or conversely, maybe the bluegill that maybe suggests that they're not doing as well?
I think that, well, so the redbreast sunfish are a tolerant species, and so it makes sense that we would see them doing better in these urban sites. It would, be one thing to see that bluegill were thriving. And I think that another thing that's really driving what we're seeing in these streams is sort of what you would call the ghost of land use past. So agricultural and rural sites can still influence, agricultural areas that have a lot of farming or whatever can still have negative impacts on the fish assemblage that's there. So for a lot of these sites that become urban, they were at one point farmland. And so I think that it's a pretty complex interaction between what's there versus what was there. And I think that it would be very interesting and more informative to do a long-term study to see okay, well, we have a site that's only been urban for, or that's in development versus has only been developed for a year versus 10 years after, are we starting to see any differences? So how long is it going to take for sort of like the ghost of land use past to not be as important versus now we're just seeing the direct effects of urbanization? So essentially, some of these streams were already degraded and had already, the fish assemblage structure had already responded, would be my hypothesis.
We got a question from the internet.
Oh, cool.
Holly wants to know if there's a way for members of the community to be involved in this actively, things like citizen science, volunteering, stream cleanups. How does anybody participate?
That's a great question. I know that NC State has a few different stream cleanups every year. The Student Fisheries Society itself at NC State has one twice a semester. We have bio blitzes at NC State, and I think it's really getting plugged into those, even like here at the museum, doing events and things like that to see what's going on both just around the community. And so it's hard to find these things, but it's just about getting plugged in and looking for them. Or if you know that you have an area or a stream that needs to be that's maybe degraded or could use some work, like getting that sort of grassroots effort yourself and doing it. And that's how actually the stream cleanup at NC State started. We clean up our own Rocky Branch, which is a stream that runs through NC State. It's a sort of a sad stream, but we try.
And all the fish came back immediately.
Absolutely. It's now just basically goldfish. I think all the college students just released their goldfish after the state fair, and they've really done well there. So,
All goldfish, I love it. Let's give Emilee one more round of applause. Thank you very much. Fantastic stuff. Great work. And hey, thanks to all of you for coming out to this week's Lunchtime Discovery presentation. Hope you learned something new to take back with you. Maybe, Emilee, you can hang out for a minute if people wanted to come up and ask more questions.
yeah, absolutely.
They thought of. And we'll see everybody again real soon. Bye, everyone.